kind of justice system we want to provide for our society. And we think that ultimately a justice system that provides a fair outcome for all individuals is one that individuals are capable of buying into and people can think is a strong one. For that reason, we are going to introduce this policy with a number of conditions. So essentially, any individual who wants to engage in criminal law work is going to have to do so via the state. We believe that individuals are likely to branch into other areas as well, and they will have dual practices where they might be doing other work but also engage in criminal work. Notice, what we are going to do is essentially break people into tranches. So essentially, if you are an individual who is in the higher tranche, you're an individual with a greater amount of experience. In the lower tranche, you have less experience. We will randomise the lawyer that you will receive when you go to trial. If you are being brought to trial for a more serious crime like murder, for instance, you will get the more experienced tranche, and that's where your lawyer will be picked from. The lower tranche will pick you for smaller petty crimes, where the outcome of that crime is less likely to be as serious, because you'll think those individuals have more experience of dealing with those kind of things. Okay. Notice what we'll also do is we'll pay these individuals an average in relation to their tranche. So if you're an individual who has a large amount of experience, we'll pay you towards what the average for a lawyer across any kind of work in that higher tranche would be. Similarly for the second tranche. So if you're a lawyer who has 15, 20 years experience, we'll give you the average of what a lawyer of 15, 20 years would receive for any kind of case, and the same for tranche number 2. 2 points though. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to make sure I'm still going to be able to represent myself if I wish.
I mean, you can, but to be honest, like, people who do that tend to have very, very bad outcomes themselves, I presume you won't. Okay, criminality and equality of arms are the 2 points we're going to bring to you. Firstly, criminality. Why is it the case that we're bringing this in as regards to criminal cases but not others? The important line that criminality distinguishes between is one that says that you are an individual who's transgressed against the most serious rules in society. Indeed, the notion of criminality is one we created only to make that distinction between the kind of actions that you're making. It carries a much stronger message at the point to which you are an individual who has been prosecuted of this kind of crime on 2 different levels. So firstly, it sends a very strong statement about the kind of individual you are and the kind of action that you took. So the possibility for you as an individual to have been prosecuted on that basis is to literally for the state to have said, and all of society to say, which is why the state takes these actions for individuals, is because it is saying that you literally have transgressed against the most serious rules in our society and you've engaged in immoral action. Notice that the distinction therefore exists then between, let's say, other kind of cases that we're not doing this, like tortious liability. Because notice, for instance, if you've committed tortious liability, all the state is saying, or all the world is saying, essentially, you've engaged in negligent action or a different form of action that simply does not carry the same kind of opprobrium or like moral messaging that we do get with this kind of action. Secondly, the distinction also exists as regards the kind of sentencing you're going to get, or the result of what that case might be. So if it's tortious action, you might receive a sentence, it might be that, or you might receive a punishment that involves paying something, for instance. But when at the point to which you engage in a criminal action, notice the sentencing we require of you is very different. You're an individual who might find themselves now in jail. You're an individual who now might find themselves literally losing years of their life. Why is this important? Because we think that ultimately, at that point, we need to make sure that the justice system is one that ensures that when you transgress against these serious rules, when you potentially could receive that moral message that says you're literally a bad person, or secondly, where you could lose those years of your life, for instance, it needs to be the case that individuals who are poorer are able to receive a likely chance of getting the same kind of outcome as a richer person. And similarly, if you're a richer individual, you cannot use your wealth to avoid the sentencing, both in the sense of the moral opprobrium of what you did, but secondly, the chance of losing years of your life or having something that just going against you. No, thank you. So while we think that wealth can be used to advantage yourself in certain ways, like for instance buying schooling or other things, we don't believe that follows for the most serious rules upon which you literally make the contract with the state in which you're living. There's a serious distinction between advantaging yourself in some ways and advantaging yourself so as to avoid criminality or to avoid the very rules that we set up the existence of the state on. We think there's a serious distinction between those 2 things. But let's talk about equality of arms. Because the problem that essentially occurs now is that individuals walk into courtrooms in which, if you're a poor individual, what happens is you are likely to find a state prosecutor and you with a less able barrister or lawyer that you've employed, or one provided by the state, who often, because they're not randomised, tend to be less well paid. Notice, the problem that then happens is, the distinction is, when you're a richer individual, you often find whole teams of well-paid, well-experienced lawyers who are capable of frustrating the justice system in a very serious way.
On exactly this.
No. That is a problem because we think that those individuals then what is created is a narrative, an understanding that the richest are both seen to be capable of frustrating the justice system and avoiding the most serious crimes in it. We think that's a problem. No, thank you. Give me 15 seconds. Notice that the problem with that is that it creates a narrative whereby the less well-off in society see a justice system less willing to engage with them and less willing to actually give them a possibility of an outcome that is fair for them. That means they don't report things as much, they don't engage with the system as much. We think that's a direct problem for when we try and actually prosecute crimes for those individuals. No, thank you. But no, it notices not only just in relation to this, to the notion that they're receiving less fairness, it is also the case that those individuals literally, richer individuals literally get better outcomes. Empirically they receive better outcomes because they're able to use they're able to use their wealth and leverage that in a manner that ensures that they can get the kind of defence lawyers and the individuals that can ensure that they don't get to have the higher sentencing that they probably deserve. I'll take closing.
So some people perceive the justice system as less fair because we don't have the capital punishment. If people wouldn't perceive it as a better, would you introduce it?
No, because the balancing between like certain different harms and like providing like a more fair justice system is different to the point at which like your balance, like if this whole society believes that murdering or that literally murdering people as a result of a crime is a more fair one, it's a different balancing act that you're playing with the loss of a life versus like the ability to make the justice system to be perceived to be more like fair. The reason why this is so important is because ultimately, as I told you at the beginning, the notion of a justice system being a fair one is literally where it derives its legitimacy from. So I, as an individual, am unable, for instance, to buy into that system at the point at which I perceive it to be unfair, at the point at which I recognise that I, as a less well-off individual, am less able to provide myself with like, the arms or the means to fight back against cases and receive actually different sentencings. But notice what's very important, that there's an intersection between the kind of people who are poor. We need to recognise the kind of people who are poor tend to be minorities or individuals who have served, who have worked within the state and have been frustrated by the state or have been abused by capital structures to ensure that they don't have that same ability to access the capital with which they could in fact, represent themselves. So at that point we think that we have a specific duty to them to ensure this judicial system is one that can actually represent them and ensure they get the outcomes they deserve. Here's you to propose.
I'd like to ask the speaker for that speech. I'd like to call upon Rory to open the case for the opposition. It is sad but unfortunate fact that the vast majority of crimes are committed by groups which are historically disenfranchised, are committed by groups who do not trust the state. Precisely, therefore, the people who are most likely to use these state-mandated, therefore not perceived to be independent defence lawyers are those who most have that historical grievance against the state. I'm going to do two things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to explain what happens inside the courtroom, why you get less justice for those groups. Secondly, what happens outside that courtroom, and why you alienate a very large number of people from that system. 3 points of rebuttal. Firstly, what is this debate about? It is not about access to basic access to justice. Why? All of the op-eds would obviously support legal aid, either in the capacity of giving you a state lawyer, if that's what you choose, or giving you cash to hire a defence lawyer. We are also happy with the fact that most criminal barristers' chambers offer pro bono defence work. We're happy to make that a legal condition of their practicing law to massively increase that. We, on our side, will allow people who are worse off or don't want to hire a state lawyer to be able to provide their own form of that. Next point of rebuttal is the opening arguments that most of their speech saying, why are we doing this for criminal law, not civil? Fine, don't care, I'm going to say it's bad that you're doing this for criminal. Next, then one argument was this means that we allow rich people to buy off justice. First of all, most rich people overwhelmingly are not those prosecuted for criminal acts. That's a statistic, and it tends to be black and poor. Then let's look at the circumstances in which that actually happened. Either you're doing it in a non-jury system like South Africa, I don't think that's particularly persuasive, by and large, because judges are not immune, are by and large actually immune to the rhetorical techniques of rich lawyers. Secondly, you're doing it in cases of juries, right? Saying that if you hired a rich barrister in the UK, you'd be able to rhetorically persuade the jury out and let the rich client off. I don't think that's particularly easy. Why? Because juries decide issues of fact, that is there enough evidence to prove you did this claim or not? It's very difficult, even though we all like debating, to rhetorically obscure facts, right? So that means that there's quite a high bar you have to overcome. The next claim, but critically, it's not rich v poor. It's not rich people prosecuting poor people. It's the state prosecuting poor people. That's the relevant comparison in this debate. We then fell back on narratives like everyone else. Like people view the justice system as unfair for every other reason. In fact, there's white people making laws that prosecute African Americans. There's racial justice that means we prosecute people who are black and take cocaine more than white. The last thing is say, well, it will decrease reporting if people don't trust the state. Will people report it less if it's the entirety of the state which we distrust, rather than their own element about it? But critically, this is what we care about. I do not mind if a very small number of rich people are able to get off. Why? Because we should construct the balance of the state laws in a way that preserves the presumption of innocence as broad as possible. Given the disparity of power between states and individuals, and the state has so much power over each individual, we should construct a system that prevents as many people as possible not being falsely imprisoned, even at the expense of some people getting the life sentence they deserve. So, firstly, what happens inside the courtroom? The first thing I want to ask here is who really know who to hire in this state system. Because most lawyers, when they qualify, make a choice between criminal and civil paths. Most people tend to do commercial law because it pays more. A very large number choose to do criminal law because they go to a commercial practice which pays them a very large amount of money. Critically though, the state will not be able to pay them that large amount of money. Why? Because the state is poor, people do not like spending taxpayers' money. But also there are so many of them you'll have to pay it. You'll have to divide the money over a huge number of people. That's incredibly damaging. Why? Because most lawyers have spent years and a lot of money training to become lawyers. That means faced at a choice of do I become a criminal or commercial lawyer? Most will now choose to become commercial lawyers because they gain so much more money to pay it off. Critically, that's the problem of opening government's men. They say we'll pay you on experience. That means when you have no experience, we'll pay you next to nothing, right? Which makes the choice even starker. So most qualified lawyers don't innately have a joy for criminal law. They receive money like most people in a capitalist society. You're going to get very few lawyers overall. Why is that damaging? Firstly, because on our side, a large number of criminal lawyers means there's good lawyers who do pro bono work, are funded by the Southern Poverty Law Centre or other NGOs who can defend poor African Americans, people who otherwise are not able to do them. But critically, in a circumstance that is characterised by a low number of probably low quality lawyers, you get a number of perverse incentives. Why? First of all, it means the state is more likely to overcharge because they do not fear good lawyers on the other side. Secondly, the state lawyers are likely to be overworked because relative to the number of cases they have, which is huge, and the number of people they have, which is relatively quite small, they'll have so many cases to go through. That means they tend not to do things like due diligence, do things like research. It means they can provide things like counter evidence to get their clients off. But critically and most importantly, if you're told you have 100 cases you have to get in a week, you're more likely to tell your client to plea bargain. Why is that catastrophic? Because most people are threatened with plea bargains by the prosecution, hoping that they'll be feared, and like say, crap, well, if I go to trial like 100 years, if a plea bargain might get 10, I'll take the plea bargain now, and rather than going to trial and forcing that conviction. That means more people who are innocent will plea bargain out of fear, because the defence lawyer is telling them to take it. That is absolutely catastrophic, I would say, closing.
In order to be a sustainable business model, the amount of pro bono cases a legal organisation can take on by definition has to be small. Surely there gets to be a point in which, in order to provide accurate representation, you're essentially just subsidising the same amount that you would be in order for, if the state was running the system full stop.
No, obviously we're not compelling them to do that much. We're compelling them to do some, to the point that there's this reasonable access to it, right? So also the state system is catastrophically worse. So, secondly then, what happens outside the courtroom? The first thing to note here is that people don't think about justice in the state, they feel it. It is an emotional relationship. That's why even if you explain to African Americans the state probably isn't racist, they probably tend to disagree. Why is that important? Because most people don't tend to distrust the state because it's classist. They tend to distrust it because it is a violent entity that's attacking their lives. Why is that important? Because you now destroy one of the most last vestiges of independence in the criminal justice system. Because people don't see a distinction between police, prosecution and state defence. They just see the defence. That's incredibly damaging because they no longer see a distinction between the police who have overcharged them and harassing them and the people they now have to defend them. And there's a number of harms to that. The first thing is I think they're less likely to cooperate with that justice system. Either in people coming forward because they themselves committed crimes and don't want to be charged, or alternatively they just don't have faith in that system will work out. So why do they do it and why do they bother? But more importantly, if you do not trust the defender you've been randomly allocated for a petty crime, which by the way are most crimes, that you have a low quality lawyer, that means you're more likely to opt to represent yourself. That is catastrophic. Why? Because nobody has any experience about law. But it puts an emotional decision of trusting someone who's from the state and you do not trust, and versus the fact, well, I'll go with myself, we think they're not insubstantial, though obviously perhaps not the majority of people will choose to represent themselves. Those people who are most in need of a lawyer, critically, they would not do that if it was a legal aid lawyer provided by the government, because they are seen to be impartial, it's not seen to be the state overreaching. Critically, and finally outside the courtroom, we stop whistleblowing within the criminal profession. Why? Because currently, people who are defence lawyers can call out overzealous prosecution, call out instances of injustice within the system, because if they know the state bars them or they fear retribution, they can go to a private commercial law firm. Critically, in your world, you don't have that possibility of escape. So lawyers who do choose criminal law now fear, perhaps even if incorrectly, the state will fine or punish them or demote them if they make any overt form of criticism. That means you silence one of the most powerful voices of critiquing that system is silent. Look, this policy aims to make the justice system more fair. It ignores the historical, racial, and arbitrary characteristics that means that it's unfair, and people have perceived that. This makes the system much worse. We're very proud to oppose.
Just quiet down, please. Now, I'd just like to let the speak for that speech and call upon Fiona to adjudicate the government.
Okay, in this speech I'm going to talk about balance. I'm going to talk about what happens when you have the richest and best paid and therefore most experienced lawyers always represented by white-collar criminals effectively instead of the state. I'm also going to talk about the interpretation of the law, how that gets worse under the status quo, better under our crop. First, a couple of points of rebuttal. I find it quite surprising that oh god, I've forgotten your name, awkward, that Rory, for example, stands up and says that the people who are most likely to be prosecuted for criminal law are the people who are the most marginalised, most disadvantaged, most likely to already rely on the state to provide them with a barrister, right? The problem is, notice how non-comparative it is when it says that now people will under our prop, people will start opting out if they do not want a state lawyer and represent themselves. Note that it is already true that the most marginalised people cannot afford a criminal lawyer and therefore rely on the state already. Yet it's not a randomised system, so you are more likely to get the worst kind of lawyer who cannot represent you. And also, we do not see people currently opting out because most people prefer not to go to jail than to stand up for their ideological principles of trying to abolish the state. Number two, the idea that judges are immune to rhetorical techniques, that's literally bullshit. In order to argue that cohesively, you have to say that social capital doesn't exist, that accents don't matter, that using long words doesn't matter. Like, unfortunately for a lot of teams in the open break, apparently it does. Being able to say things in long words matters more than being able to say things in shorter words. So unless you are willing to defend that, I'm going to say that was a waste of your time. Number two, when he says that we fall back on narratives because, there's little enough there, I'm sorry, Rory, but SAS is probably a bad strategic substitute for analysis. The problem is, at the point at which you actively see the people who are defending criminals, in your view, criminals who are rich, and they are getting away with things that you would not get away with, that is a real harm to you individually. You do not feel protected by that state. You are also less likely to seek an investigation because you do not think that you will get a level representation. So if it is the case that we fix that narrative harm, note that there are also consequential benefits to that, so we still win that. Number four, the idea that now there'll be so many lawyers that they're all going to be, first of all, there are going to be so many lawyers that are going to have to pay them very little money, and yet contemporaneously, there's going to be so much work for each of them to do because there'll be so few of them. I'm going to ask you to choose. We think what probably is going to happen is that the state is going to set a quota for the amount of lawyers things will need and hire that amount in the same way it does civil servants, so it is unclear why now you get a massive pool of criminal lawyers. Not finally. No, guys, that's bad. Or unless you're agreeing with me, in which case, yay. Okay. The idea that now more people choose commercial law because it pays better. That is true under the status quo. People who choose commercial law often do so because it pays you a hell of a lot better. For example, I currently have a contract sitting at home for an obscene amount of money to do work I have no interest in doing, but I do want to make a lot of money, so I will probably sign it. Importantly, though, now the incentive to go into criminal law is the same, which is that you get to represent these ideology, you possibly get to write or argue the winning case in something that is constitutional, which is massive for you. Okay, and finally, that lawyers become worse because now they force a plea bargain. Note again, already true of free legal aid lawyers. So now, under the status quo, what they are happy to prop up is a system where the poorest people, where the people who are already reliant on the state, plea bargain or settle, which is they say is bad, so it's unclear whether they're happy to stand over for the poorest, but not the richest. If that is an ideological divide they're willing to stand over, I think that's abhorrent. And then finally, that people are going to start off. Secondly, on now lawyers getting worse, also not true because now the only way you can make your name as as a lawyer is by winning cases, which means you have every reason to do due diligence, for example. You have every reason to ensure that you represent your client to the best possible ability that you can, because then possibly the state won't fire you and you wouldn't have a job anymore. Okay, let's talk about the state representing us. Note when the state prosecutes you for a crime, it does so not in the name of the victim, it does so in the name of the state that it represents. That is why you are prosecuted by the CPU or the DPP in Ireland, for example. You are not prosecuted, for example, by me if you assault me. Why is that important? It means that when the state represents itself and represents the country it represents in a criminal trial, it is doing so on all of our behalf and on behalf of the law that it stands up for. Problematically, it is true that a lot of the reasons why lawyers stay in the public sphere is because they are paid better, the private sphere is because they are paid better in the private sphere. As a private criminal lawyer, if you make it as a private criminal lawyer, it is more lucrative for you to be in that sphere than not. That means that the people who are best at exploiting loopholes in legislation, the people that are best at interpreting law in favour of their client, the people who can use the longest words and argue the most cogently, stay in the private sphere and act and militate against the state. No, guys, that's bad. Importantly, why that matters is that you are effectively stacking the deck against the state in all cases. Note that when you stack the deck against the state, you not only stack it against the state, like the victim that had that crime possibly perpetrated against them, but against all of us. And as the law, as a concept, we'll go on to that further in a second, but go ahead, Rory.
Do you not think that rich defendants might still be able to hire private investigators and other things to give evidence to their state-employed lawyers, and they can still gain a particular advantage, and you just screw over everyone else?
Like, again, Rory, if that's your comparative, then note that I'm still happier that if that is true, and they get that advantage, I'm still happier that now people who cannot pay for any kind of rich criminal lawyer who is good will still have the ability to get a better lawyer. So if that's comparative, note that we are still winning on that. I think it probably is true that you will buy a legal team and maybe have them behind the scenes, but note that even if that does happen, you still have people being able to access better lawyers on our side of the house, and those are the people you said you cared about. Now, why the law gets worse, right? Note that criminal law, and especially criminal law, is written in very vague terms. That's because crime is so individualised. You cannot legislate for every possible outcome. You cannot legislate for every possible crime. That means you have to leave a lot of discretion towards the individual judge. You have to leave a lot of discretion to the jury. Importantly, that means that those facts have to be filled in by opposing lawyers, by defending lawyers, by the jury themselves. When you always have lawyers on one side, for example, defending rich criminals, who are able to fill in that law in the way that best suits their client, it means that you ultimately get law that is better suited to getting criminals out of jail than you do get law that is better suited to protecting victims. I think that's problematic. As the state is the actor in this debate, we think it should not create law that specifically benefits people who it should be putting into jail. It should not let that system continue to happen. Note also, I was going to do a bit about how barristers tend to be men and tend to be awful, but ultimately, if it is the case that instead of being now beholden to a system of patronage, as is the case in chambers, or as is the case when you just have individual barristers looking out for other individual barristers, now you have the state employing everyone, which makes it more likely that you will take on, for example, women or people from marginalised communities, because the state has better oversight mechanisms for that, whereas we can't do that in the private sphere. Look, at the lowest level, this is already the status quo, because the poorest people already rely on the state. We randomise it, we make it more likely that you get a better lawyer, and we defeat that imbalance. We're incredibly happy to propose.
Speech and call on Alex to continue the case for the opposition. Some points of rebuttal before going into the arguments we've heard from Rory and developing them further, bringing you new analysis as to exactly why the principle of justice is being violated here.
First of all, the economics of the legal system. So there's some very strange stuff coming out of opening government, where they want to make a radical change and try and ensure there is as few impacts as possible. Importantly, it might be true that you can pay some money as a state lawyer to the individual. But more importantly, the fact that you can have more people going into barristers is because 1 or 2 rich clients will pay 6 or 7 figures, allowing you to then better represent people who are less vulnerable. It is an indirect form of taxation that allows the wealthy in some areas to pay into the legal system, which is where these high, as you say, very tempting salaries come from. It might be true that the state can offer some money, but it will always be a significantly smaller quantity, and the number of people capable of earning that maximum quantity is much smaller. As you can see, money is an enormous motivator, and as a consequence, there will simply be fewer people going into the judicial system under your metric. More importantly, these people are often competitive. They have a sense of objective skill they wish to prove. These tranches will be considered vague, uncertain, hard to identify. Progress will be much more difficult than within a neat, organised legal system that allows you to promote yourself effectively. This means commercial law does become much more successful. It means that there are fewer lawyers going in. It means there are fewer lawyers available, and a lot of these harms stand. You then say that the ability to bias judges is, of course, significant. What we are saying is that the capacity you have to move someone who is guilty to a lower sentence is a law of diminishing returns. It takes an enormous amount of capital in legal skill to take 3 or 4 years off a certain conviction of a sentence. But what this means is we are happy to accept that rich people, as is always the case, will be slightly advantaged if that money is then reinvested back into a legal system that can better provide justice for the majority, for some specific reasons I will talk about. Finally, what is this debate? And this is the most important part that they do not understand. We are happy, all of us in opposition, I've checked, are happy to say that we are totally fine with legal aid, we are totally fine with some states where this might apply, developing a provision for the defendant. It is giving them money to then give to a private defender. That is a fundamental principal difference from having a defender employed by the state. A very interesting and nuanced difference, which is why we are debating it, but one which is incompatible with the claim that this is all about capital, because it's not. It's about justice. It's about a lot more than simply asserting that there will be more or less money available for the poor on either side, because that is true in some examples where this might apply, it is not true in others. So, what are we talking about here? First of all, we think that there is a specific harm that I want to talk about with regards to exactly how individuals will be disadvantaged, vulnerable individuals will be disadvantaged by this proposition. A lot of this comes from the fact that they allocate these judges, these lawyers, to the defendants. This is enormously pernicious because, for one, statistically, these lawyers are more likely to be advantaged. They are more likely to be white, they are in some instances more likely to be male, and I would say it is unclear to me why the state is so perfect at overcoming these discriminatory elements as they assert. We think it is equally probable that there will be women or men in law on both sides. But more importantly, why is this so pernicious in places like South Africa, in places like America, in places like Europe, where you have specific problems? You have a high probability of a black defendant being assigned a disinterested white lawyer who goes into that case relatively convinced that he probably did it. Like, he's probably just another one of these minorities who I am funneling through a racist system. Because the unfortunate reality is, lawyers don't match liberal norms within society. If anything, they tend towards conservative norms for a number of unpleasant reasons with regards to how these processes select. The consequence of this is, if you simply assign lawyers, there is a high probability that someone from a marginalised group will have someone come and represent them who has little empathy, little understanding. And the fact that under the status quo they can find someone who has a specific capacity to care about their case, to care about the suffering they have gone through, and translate that to a jury or to a judge is an enormous weapon against the disparity of state power that we are trying to prevent. I will take closing.
The average American public defendant would need 1.5 years under the status quo to get through that current year's worth of work. How do you think that system might change, given that it's completely failing the vast majority?
Well, for one, Rory told you why we think that would get worse, because you have fewer lawyers, and as a consequence have a higher caseload, which leads to all the particular incentives he gave you. So insofar as there might be fewer lawyers to deal with these cases, that becomes completely more pernicious to the point at which there are fewer people becoming lawyers. But more specifically, these are the harms we're talking about. You should have a right, as a defendant, to pick someone who you feel understands the grounds upon which you wish to build your case. It is a legitimate claim for a defendant to say that I wish to be represented by a black lawyer, or by at least a lawyer whose caseload demonstrates to me that he does not have a racial bias against me specifically. And consequently, this allows you to begin to mould a defence against an oppressive state who perpetuates the very norms that have been likely to ensure you are in that courtroom in the first place, because you're facing 6 years for 2 grams of marijuana possession, because there is a ludicrous judicial system marginalising you specifically. You are stripping away the power that vulnerable communities have to select individuals who are capable of advantaging them in an already disadvantaged society. And even if we do accept your money discussion, we think in many ways this is worse than capital, because you have complete ambivalence on your side when you face an oppressive state. And I want to talk about the state. I want to talk about exactly what we are talking about here, because this is a much more significant distinction than government would have you believe. The state is a monolithic entity with a monopoly on power who has the capacity, which is somewhat trippy when you sit back and thinking about it, to pick you up and put you in a room for 9 years because you deserve it. Now obviously, we have become normalised to the assumption that the state is here to stay, and even I, with my tendencies, would agree that it probably is here to stay and that has some benefits. But more significantly, we say that it is a valuable principle to have defence and criticism of the judicial system from being outside the judicial system. Why is this so important? For both the defendants and for the lawyers themselves. For one, law is not morality. There are a huge quantity of laws that are enormously immoral, that are specifically discriminatory, that persecute you for your sexual preference, for your identity, your gender, your faith. And this applies in countries where these norms are particularly unhelpful. Why is this significant? Because for one, as Rui has identified, the defendant is very likely to feel, when the state is prosecuting them and defending them, that there is a conflict of interest, and are more likely to believe that considering the state formed the norms that have marginalised them as an individual in their community for generations, that the defence is not going to be a good one. They are more likely to be convinced, as Rui has identified, that they don't have a hope in hell. They are more likely to take a belligerent plea bargain. But more significantly, it prevents any criticism of the legal system externally, because often defence lawyers are the most capable advocates for addressing injustices, because they are a separate group who recognises moments when the state enormously overreaches. We get bad laws all the time. The UK just made it illegal to rip an iTunes DVD onto your computer. That is an actual law that now exists. You need the capacity to be not employed by the government to say that you think this is a bad place, that you can advocate for it, and still be employed by a private enterprise, rather than being trash dumped because you had the audacity to raise a criticism of a particular harm. You get particular harms for minorities, you get a worse legal discourse, you give the state monolithic power, you make it less likely to get justice, and all in all, we can still give legal aid to rectify some of this, so I urge you to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech, and I'd like to call upon Paige to extend the case.
Rui stands up here and says to you all that it's an unfortunate fact that socially and economically disadvantaged groups are just more likely to commit crime. We challenge that. We say they're more likely to be convicted of crime, and to the extent this is a narrative, is demonstrative of the fact that there is inadequate provision within the justice system currently. There's no evidence to suggest this reflects actual disparities in criminality. We're simply not looking at white, powerful criminals at the moment, and that's what we plan to change. What we think this motion will actually do is make access to justice significantly better for these disadvantaged groups. And even if it didn't, we actually care more about equal access to justice than that anyway. First, in terms of some rebuttals. So we have this whole thing about like, well, you won't have whistleblowers, it'll all be state controlled. I mean, to be quite clear, we're obviously not propping Kafka, right? Like, as public defenders work in the US, there's obviously a separation of powers. Insofar as the state funds them, we can't fire them for being too good. That's obviously nonsensical and not what we're propping. They then said, well, people will opt out because they'll be so like disenfranchised and alienated. I mean, probably not. Even under the current totally appalling provision that opening up recognise African Americans who are massively disenfranchised from the state still go for public defenders, precisely because like otherwise to do so otherwise would be absolute suicide. But I just want to lay out, right, exactly how differential access to justice works. Because they said like rich people do slightly better. R. Kelly, his lawyer, managed to convince the jury that he was not guilty of an assault on a 14-year-old girl, despite a video of him doing this, had been distributed all over the internet and was shown to the court. And his lawyer convinced the jury that it was not possible to prove that this wasn't a stunt double of R. Kelly, and he got off, right? There is no way that any people would believe that unless it was coming from the kind of lawyers that we're talking about, the celebrity lawyers who have differential powers of persuasion. They give the example of South Africa, right? In the case of Oscar Pistorius, Judge Masipa, who is widely recognised for being harsh in terms of defendants who commit violence against women, was convinced by Oscar Pistorius' a phenomenally influential and very well-paid lawyer, that she should not count his previous acts of violence against women as indicative of the likelihood of whether or not he killed his girlfriend, right? So it's nonsensical to say that either judges or juries are immune from social bias or take into reputations seriously. Secondly, in terms of just the ability of these lawyers to drag prosecutions out, like you just have the ability to bury overworked public prosecutors in paperwork. The fact that like Berlusconi can drag out all of his court cases until the statute of limitations is over demonstrates there is effectively a culture of impunity for the hyper-powerful who are able to pay their lawyers to use any legal means possible to flout the law. Also in terms of the resource disparity, in terms of the private investigators they talk about. Like, obviously it's quite important that the private investigator is actually affiliated to the law body in question, because you can't just accept evidence as a lawyer and put it into court if you can't verify it. But at the moment, you can hire private investigators, which means you're able, in terms of jury selection, to throw out anyone who you might possibly think would be biased against your defendant. Similarly, things that poor people don't have, right? Also in terms of pre-trial motions, the ability to rake over every single piece of evidence and throw out every single thing that could possibly be prejudicial. Again, a thing that poor people don't have. So all the things they're talking about, the reason that our jails are full of people of ethnic minorities is not because they're more likely to commit crime, it's precisely because there is differential access to justice, and that is wrong. I want to talk now about why you have incentives to make provision better. So that currently, we acknowledge that provision is absolutely appalling. That's because the powerful have no incentive to make it any better. Because you know, as a white wealthy person, you're going to be able to pay for that lawyer to throw out your pre-trial motions, to go over all of the evidence, and to hire that private investigator. And then the public prosecutor simply doesn't have the ability to see through that gone through the 5 or 10 years that your very wealthy lawyer can drag it out. Yes, go.
The reason that there is a majority of minorities in prison is that the court system creates crimes like mandatory possessions specifically targeted at African Americans. It is not true, as you claim, that there is not a problem here that we need to recognise and legislate around.
Okay, and then when the police arrest African Americans who are poor, they know that they can force them to a plea bargain because that is very quick. If they arrest someone who's white and powerful and can pay for a lawyer, they know that they're going to spend 10 years trying to drag it through the court as their lawyer goes out. That's exactly why you get that differential. But the thing is, what this changes is now white wealthy people are going to be like, Christ, I could actually be falsely accused of something. I could be taken to court, and I don't have the option of paying for a wealthy lawyer. And particular crimes like rape, right, which like white wealthy men think that they're going to be falsely accused of, it's going to really scare the shits into people, right? We think that's important because now the hyper-powerful, now the wealthy, now the privileged actually have an incentive to make provision of public justice better. When it affects you, when it affects your family and your community, and not just the ethnic minorities that you think are criminals anyway, that's when you'll actually start caring about making public provision better. So we think in general, actually, public provision will get phenomenally better precisely because there are now all the political incentives to put more money into it. Also in terms of like the fact that you are now going to have potential miscarriages of justice, but they're going to happen to white people as well as to black people and to wealthy people as well as to poor people. The incentives for political scrutiny are much greater because the poor, innocent, white, rich person in prison sells more papers than the poor black person in prison. So you now have massive incentives to actually have better political scrutiny, to actually have properly funded justice systems. Even if there is a case of a miscarriage of justice and more white wealthy people end up in prison, we have to probably actually create incentives to make the prison system better, and again, make life better for all of the people that you want to talk about. Also in terms of like, oh, everyone will leave the law. I mean, it's incredibly difficult for barristers to retrain once you've got into that. Also in terms of what the OG said about like, there are other reasons you go into it, like it's, you know, a sexy profession or whatever. But again, we actually think that public defenders will be paid more. All you need to do is bring it up to the level of public prosecutors, which is like 80k a year, right? Which you absolutely, as a white person in politics, have an incentive to do because you might be Berlusconi and now you have to go to court and now that you're going to have a public defender, you have an incentive to actually pay them properly. Okay, why then we should care more about differential access? So Alex says, you should have a right to choose your lawyer. You should have a right to choose someone who identifies with you and who you can trust, right? Most people do not have that right. The black person who is accused of cannabis possession that he wants to talk about does not currently have that right. They are assigned a public defender, they are not entitled to that right. So if it is a human right, you need to goddamn well explain why this doesn't apply to everyone, why we don't give everyone unlimited resources to be able to fund their defence. Given we cannot do that, it is obviously better to say that no one should have that right and everyone should have equal access to justice. Why? Because even if it's something you disagree with, like so for example stop and search laws, we think they're bad, it's still better that they would apply to everyone equally than that we seek out specific groups that they apply to. So even if you buy the stuff about the median level being lower, that is obviously better than it disproportionately affecting one particular minority. Obviously this isn't a perfect right, because otherwise we would provide it to everyone. You need to explain why which white people get this right and the rest of people don't. Very proud.
Thanks for that speech. I'd like to call upon Elle to present the case in the opposition.
Gentlemen, 3 points in my speech. First of all, setting precedents and how this improves the entire legal system. Second of all, the person's right to defend himself. Third of all, why the comparative, why we would rather have more people, guilty people walking free than more innocent people being in jail. Before that, a few points of rebuttal. Starting with what is not in this debate. Two things from opening government that are simply not inside this debate. First of all, is there a system of randomization and incentives in the public defense system? Because we can do that under status quo without banning private attorneys. We think it may be a good system, we think it may be a good idea to implement, but not relevant to this motion. Second of all, the trust in the public system is also not relevant. How do we know that? Because in response to our POI, they acknowledge themselves this is an inferior clash in that they say, if we have to harm some defendant's right, for example, by having the capital punishment, we would not prioritize that for the benefit of public trust in the system. Therefore, by their own analysis, this is not an important clash in this debate. Now let's talk about what we hear from closing government. Because, first of all, they tell us people are still going to be good. First of all, they tell us that lawyers can influence trials. Obviously, we accept that lawyers can sometimes influence trials. We think the motion would have no purpose if it didn't. If any person could represent you to the same level of ability, obviously there would be no point in this debate. But notice, they don't actually show us that this is going to improve the situation of the worst off in society. The only analysis they give us there is that they say today some improvements, some vague improvements which they have not clarified, are not made enough. And if we're going to give rich people more of an incentive to do them, then we will have those things. No, this is a very weird way to enact certain changes. If you want to enact those specific changes, enact them instead of making the whole system worse in order for people to okay, then they tell us, but people are still going to come into the system. First of all, maybe the people who already qualified as criminal lawyers may not have a choice, but the people in the next generation definitely, when they're faced with high-tech, medicine, and all sorts of other professions, when this doesn't apply, are obviously not going in. And second of all, as opening opposition already tell you, they're going to have significantly less resources for each individual case. I'm going to explain why that's hugely important in my first point. Then they tell us, their last point, if we cannot provide everyone with a specific right, we should not provide it to anyone. We think that is absurd. We think if that were true, and we say, for example, that being financially well off is an important thing, then you would have to take everyone's property because some people don't have it. We don't accept it. Let's talk about this. Opening opposition. Tell us about the fact that that we have better lawyers and we have some pro bono representation. On that, the governments tell them, but there isn't actually massive trickle down here because the poor people can't actually access the systems as well, right? So what we tell you is very simply, the justice system is an evolving system. It evolves through precedents, it evolves through things like, for example, appeals to higher courts, which set certain legal precedents. The fact that, for example, the US Supreme Court has decided that searching people's phones is banned under the Fourth Amendment is something that only happened because you had a lawyer that had enough time and on a specific case, enough of a revenue on that specific case to take it all the way to the Supreme Court in order to set that sort of precedent. We say that is something only a private lawyer, a very rich, very successful private lawyer, or a group of those lawyers as what's characterized by opening government, they are the only ones who can do this. And we say once you have these sort of corrections, they apply to all society. They make it better specifically for those who are constantly frisked on the streets, specifically for those who are constantly searched by the police. They get significantly more rights under our side of the house. These sort of precedents simply don't work under your side. Opening government tells us, oh, but they go against the state, and that is horrible because the state is us. No, the state is a huge organization with disproportional power versus the individual defendant. We say it's a terrible idea to make the state stronger in this balance. Let's talk about my right to defend a person's right to defend himself. Because opening government tells us that the criminal justice system is different. Therefore, you should not be able to use your money. We did not actually get an analysis why that difference means that specific thing. Because on the contrary, if they tell us that the legal sanction is the worst thing the state can do to you, obviously you should have more of a chance to be able to defend yourself. We say that they brush away our POI, in which we ask them, can a person defend himself? They say, well, he won't choose to. But the fact is, he can and has the right to. Why is that? Because basically, we say every person has his due, he should have his time in court, he should have his ability to present his position to the best way possible. Because he's not proficient in the legal language, we allow him lawyers, which are the extension of himself. How do we know this? Because they are supposed to take care specifically of his interests. They are supposed to do this in a way that's most suitable to that person. We say that this is the reason why they have privileges. For example, where they can't reveal his secrets. They have certain rights that apply to them. Now we say, obviously, I have the right to choose which lawyer I perceive as the best extension of myself, specifically when I'm under such a major threat, specifically when the state is actually threatening me. Before I go on, opening.
Okay, we can see that that's all that's relevant, but the reason why you still get precedence and so on in terms of marijuana usage is because the only way to climb the ladder now as a lawyer is to win all of the cases you are given. That's why all the cases are still happening.
Thank you. Basically, no. Nobody wins all the cases. You'll have to drop significantly many other cases, which is against every sort of incentive that you have. Let's talk about the win, because no, under their side of the house, we accept it under status quo. Some rich people, and maybe some middle class people as well, because hiring a private lawyer is not only to the richer class, but some people who are guilty do walk out free. On the other hand, under their side of the house, we get significantly less good lawyers. Therefore, we have more people who are actually innocent getting in jail. What we need to do is to make the comparative of which scenario is worse. Why is it worse when when innocent people go to jail than it is for guilty people to walk free? First of all, we say the severity of the sanction. Because we take years of a person's life, this is the strongest sanction a state can enact against someone, then we want the balance to be on the side of letting that person free. Specifically because most crime, even if we let out a criminal, most crime is not recurring, most crime does not actually cost people's lives or living. Specifically, they say that most of it is petty crime. So this is the first issue. Second issue is we have so much strong tendencies towards the government side today because we have, for example, the police who are a private interrogation office working for the state in order to convict you. You have the perception of the judges themselves as defending society. For all these things, we say the balance should sit on the other side, meaning you better lawyers and more chance of guilty people walking free than the other case. For all these reasons, we are proud to oppose.
That speech for one person is made to the government.
In many ways, we agree with the diagnosis of side opposition. In 2013, in the United States, 97% of cases in which the defendant went to prison without an outright acceptance of all charges were plea bargains. These were, in the vast majority of cases, young, poor black men who probably didn't commit the crime that they did, but were forced by a public defense lawyer to accept that they did for the hope of a reduced prison sentence because the lawyer just didn't have the time and resources to help them. If you do not think that that is an outright infringement of every individual's right to justice, then you are clearly wrong and probably a bit racist. Then the question is, how do we solve that problem? Now, the only response we got in closing opposition to Kate's speech was, well, you're being very vague. Some specifics. We want to double the salaries of public defenders who currently earn significantly less than public prosecutors. Why? Because the public thinks that we need to be tough on crime, so are happy to give money there, but don't think the defendants are worth it. Notice what's coming out here. Some kind of need for structural analysis of power and incentives within society and a genuine defense of public goods, because when you make everyone reliant on it, then that creates all the types of political pressures to keep the system intact, to ensure that adequate funds are given, and to make sure that people are left behind. Because we think that that is more important than any consideration in the debate. We think the closing government won, and I didn't have to unzip my dress this time. Just a quick piece of rebuttal before I move on to my substantive, which is firstly going to talk about improving representation and having an adequate provision of justice across the board, and then secondly, some stuff about rich people getting off and principles of justice, getting off crimes, that is. Extraneous rebuttal about precedent. So this is the argument about constitutional stuff. Okay, first of all, we do not think that you necessarily need the best and brightest lawyer to win a case on precedent. Notice what we see in these cases is an overwhelming amount of NGO support and legal expertise that go into support a criminal prosecution. That means that even if you have a face to a criminal case, the chances are this person is going to be buttressed by all types of by all sorts of support, which means that that impact is very low. Also, I think it was not responsive to the stuff that we heard about expertise and tranching that we heard in opening government. The chances are, if it's a very high-profile case, if it's a case that's going to be very significant, you're going to get, I don't know, tranche number 3, or maybe tranche number 4, maybe there'll be a whole new tranche for these types of cases of lawyers. We don't think that that is necessarily a part of the debate, and that could easily be met out within the model, so we think that that was largely not a key issue. No, thanks. On improving the quality of legal access, we talked to you about the mass overburdening. Opening opposition want to say that this is not an issue of the debate. Straight off the bat, what did they say? Well, we're happy to give people legal aid. If you give people legal aid, you do not get more money than the cost of a public defendant. That means they go to a private defendant who's also very low paid and likely to be not very good. It's not a very good option. You can't give people enough legal aid to get them access to the very best lawyers in the world. That would clearly be an unsustainable policy. But insofar as you're happy to throw money at the problem, we say throw money at the problem, but do so in a system that provides adequate access rather than showers it onto specific individuals so that nobody's left behind. Okay, then they're like, pro bono work is great because, first of all, the amount of work that this involves is just tiny. Given that you've already told us how vast the number of criminal cases brought against the poor is compared to the rich. Just numerically, that's not going to work out because you literally have to people doing like, I don't know, 50 cases for the poor and then 1 for the rich. And the idea that it's fine because you get so much money from the rich that you can afford to do that. No, because of the opportunity cost involved, right? All the time you spend adequately in investigating the cases of poor people is time that you forego in huge amounts of money. So that's clearly not an adequate response. Hence why the situation is so bad at the moment, which I think I fairly adequately demonstrated. No thanks. Okay, why do we say that the representation improves more generally across the board for all people involved? Notice we get accused that this is vague. Why don't we just make it? It is a standard case in political theory that the importance of requiring all people to have access to an institution, whether rich or poor, is because it maintains a decent quality of provision across the board. We say that even if we have, like, I don't know, in a piecemeal way, the policies enacted by us, there would always be political pressure to force it down, exactly because you never have the sustained types of incentives needed to create the system adequate and fair for all. What were these things we talked about? One, rich people feel trials, even if that's whether they're being falsely accused. But notice there's some really powerful people in the media, in the political world, in the business world. These people often just commit a lot of crimes. Like, they don't talk about it, they often do it, like tax fraud, like dodgy murders, drug dealers, they all do that type of thing. And these people are opinion setters, so they have a lot of sway within society, and it's very important to get them on board rather than let them, have their own private lawyers. No thanks. We also think that, we also told you about how there's a substitution effect. The point is that, like, not all criminal lawyers will leave, and so there's some type of redistribution, not least because they can't retrain, as Kate pointed out. But people going into the industry, I mean, they'll get 80,000 euros a year or whatever. It's like a decent wage. So if you're going in and you're not already committed to a high wage, we say that lots of people, or at least some people, do it out of a sense of public service. We also told you about the political scrutiny and wanting to avoid high-profile instances where there's poor representation. This just means that everyone will be examining the quality of representation. All the opening opposition response to this is like, well, if the system's overburdened and more people have to use it, then that's clearly worse. Only if you think there is a fixed number of resources. We say that this policy necessitates a huge transfer of resources for political reasons. That was our case, and on that basis we won, because then we're giving a decent quality of justice to the most worst of in society. We think that's fundamentally more important. Opening.
Your extension intends to force the privilege to influence justice to their advantage. You fail to recognise their advantage remains enshrined by race and class, and allowing minorities, NGOs and charities...
To a degree, to a degree, it makes us maintain the race and class. I'm not going to lie, if you had a really bad, overstretched lawyer who was dealing with 15 cases at a time, probably the fact that you're white is not enough to get you the exact sentence that you want. Still a pretty big incentive, it sounds like to me. Okay, so yeah, the response then we get, like, this idea of, like black people won't trust the system, so they'll want to choose their own lawyer, already proven that they're heavily reliant on the system at the moment. So other stuff that we heard about why this was a good thing. So we heard it's a good thing because we need to have individuals who aren't employed by the state to comment on the law. We'll give protections to whistleblowers. I mean, if you were going to get fired from your job, you'd go to an employment tribunal. It wouldn't even be a criminal case in that case. But also, people can still externally criticize the law. It's not lawyers on the job who are the only people who are allowed to do this. And even if lawyers on the job wanted to criticize the law, we'd make sure they weren't being able to be fired for it. Okay, so the final thing that I want to move on, onto this principle of justice stuff. Okay, so what we say is this is reliant on their an assumption that you will not get an adequate provision under the status quo, right? And we think that that's necessarily going to be the case. That is an important principle. That's why we need to ensure it for everybody. Our policy does that. Anything extra than that clearly can't be a fundamental human right, because then we need to provide it for the poor. That was a challenge we gave to the opposition. Finally, on rich people getting off, we gave you the specific analysis of what types of rhetoric are persuasive, but in particular the other tricks that rich lawyers use, all the time that they have to flood people with objections, the private investigators that they hire, the public lawyers would never do, right? Because they're suspicious of these private investigators. They don't have the same type of long-standing professional bond with them, which means that they're more likely to resort to underhanded motives, such as finding dodgy information out to intimidate the other side. On that basis, we prove that we give, finally, a decent enough standard for everybody under this system, and we create the appropriate political incentives, because that stops a mass violation of justice, the most important consideration in this debate. We beg to propose.